Hi and welcome to Lois and Morgana Davidson Art. It's Lois here today, and today I'm going to be painting this beachscape or seascape for you of Cuckmere Haven on the south coast of England, and I'm going to be taking a little bit longer than usual, and hopefully beginners will find this a really helpful tutorial, as I'll be showing you the process from start to finish. How I simplify the photograph, then how I sketch it out in pencil, and then putting in the simple line work with a waterproof fine liner, and finally getting onto the painting. So hopefully beginners will enjoy seeing the process unfold in its entirety, warts and all, because there will be a few mistakes along the way, a few problems to have to resolve. This is part of the joy of watercolour painting, is learning to be able to react when things don't quite go according to plan, and make little decisions to sort of try to mitigate any of these mistakes and move forward beyond them without getting too bound up with a sense of misplaced perfectionism. I'm using a photograph that Morgana took last year from the summer, and it's a little bit overwhelming. It's got lots of green algae on the beach, which I don't want to paint. So part of my simplification process is going to be to strip that out and use more conventional colours for the beach. So I'll be keeping my beach just a simple sort of combination of sand, shingle and rocks. The sky I'm going to keep much the same as that, pretty much a blue sky with a few hazy white clouds. And I'm going to simplify the breakwater just down to a few lines stretching out into the sea, because that's quite an attractive feature that links the sea to the land with the coastguard cottages and the sea wall. The cliffs themselves and the cottages surrounded by trees and the sea wall are fairly simple already, so I'm just going to be trying to copy those basic shapes. Now I've thought about the structure, let's think about the value, the tonal values, the lights, the midtones and the darks. If you half close your eyes and look at the photograph, the sky is light, the sea is light, the cottages are light, but we've got midtones and dark tones, particularly around the sea wall, the breakwater, parts of the cliff and the trees that surround the cottages. And there are more midtones on the beach and on the cliffs. And it's using these tonal values fairly correctly in a simplified form that will give a look of realism, even though we are painting in a loose style, trying to keep it very fresh and very simple, and hopefully beginner friendly too. So let's start on the drawing. I'm going to rule a horizon line very faintly, about a third of the way up from the bottom of my page, keeping it nice and straight. And then I'm going to start to just put in a very simple shape for my cliff. For this, I'm looking constantly at my photograph, and I'm not trying to get every single part of it perfect, but just trying to get the general proportions of the smallest piece of distant cliff, and then the general proportions of the cliffs as they come a little bit closer. I'm also trying to consider the fact that with perspective, the cliffs become larger as they come forward. And then trying to just keep those simple shapes just of the gable ends of these three little coastguard cottages that are visible from this angle. I'm using a chunky carpenter's pencil for this drawing, and the reason I use a large pencil is because it stops me from getting bogged down with too much detail when I'm drawing out my line work. A chunky pencil is like using a large brush for a loose watercolour painting. It stops you from fiddling too much. So I'm just trying to make sure that the proportions of my sea wall are reasonably accurate or convincing. It doesn't have to be exactly the same as in the photograph. Remember, this is a painting. We're not trying to produce an exact rendering of the photograph. It's an interpretation. So it really doesn't matter if certain parts of the seawall are slightly larger than they are in real life. The important thing is that the painting itself and the features in it sort of balance out and work well together in harmony, so that we end up with a really nice, pleasing painting with nice proportions. So using a few vertical lines just to indicate where the great big iron girders of the seawall are, just on the edge. And that's a really nice feature in this painting, because that will give us a nice strong dark which will draw the eye to our cottages. So now to pencil in the breakwater, which is quite a bit further forward. So we're going to be placing some of those posts over in front of our seawall, and they should stand out really nicely and help to give our scene depth and distance. As the breakwater goes off into the sea, I want to keep the base where the pilings come out of the sea or the sand nice and flat. So I'm using a ruler and I'm going to draw up my pilings from the ruler, and that will give them all the same base point and should be a really nice feature. And remember, as you're sketching out the scene, if you make any mistakes, you can always erase your pencil marks. It's always best to press very lightly with your pencil. From one of my own paintings, I wouldn't press quite as hard as this, but I need the lines to show up for you so as you can sort of follow along with your drawing. So that's the sketch nearly done. I just need to put in just a few light lines to indicate the sweep of the beach, sort of where the water and the watery pools are gathering in the sand in the foreground, maybe the indication of where a few sort of rocks and stones are going to be in the foreground too, but not too much, because we'll paint the rest in. So the pencil sketch is done. Now it's time to put in the waterproof fine liner inked line work. And for this I'm going to use a 0.3mm Faber Castell fine liner. It's in their range of artists' Pitt pens, and I think they're really nice pens to use, especially if you're just getting started out with line and wash. This one is a size S or small, as I say, 0.3 mils, and it's great for this sort of scale of painting. So all I'm going to do is go over the outline, the pencil outline, carefully with my fine liner. You can of course use any brand of fine liner or ink pen, but just please make sure that your ink is waterproof. I bought a new fountain pen which had waterproof ink, and I started doing a demo using it, and the ink just ran completely. And so even though it says waterproof on the actual bottle, in actual fact, in reality, it wasn't waterproof. So it's best to do a little test first if you're not too sure, to avoid disappointment. The paper that I'm using today is 100% cotton, and it's made by Saunders Waterford. It's cold pressed, which means it has a sort of medium grained texture. It's sort of got more texture than hot pressed paper, which is very smooth and a little bit difficult to paint on, but not quite as much texture as rough. Rough is a lovely surface, but again, that's a little bit harder to paint on until you get used to it. So I would recommend beginners to work with cold pressed paper, as it's a really nice, versatile and approachable paper to use. My paper is quarter imperial size, and that's about 11 inches by 15 inches, or 28 centimetres by 38 centimetres. But of course, please use any size that you're happy using of paper that you've got, and adjust your sizes according to the scale of your paper. So you can see really how easy it is now to put the line work in, as long as we've got the drawing right to start with. And that's the important thing. If your drawing is just about right, then you can just literally go over the lines with your waterproof fine liner. Once the outline is all in, then I can just focus on putting in a little bit of tone to get the painting started off in some of the darker areas, like the shadows on the seawall in some places, perhaps a little bit of tone in the dark trees that surround that little grassy bank there, and then some little directional sort of hit and miss dotted lines to add texture to the grassy bank. And then again, a little bit more tone around where those trees are going to go in front of the cottages and around the cottages. That starts me off, and it actually gives me a good sort of guide as to the kind of brushstrokes that I'm going to be looking for and the kind of tone that I'm going to be adding with my paint. Just keeping the touch with the pen quite light here for these sort of feathery touches, just a few sort of strata lines on the cliffs, maybe a few sort of indications of some large concrete blocks on the seawall, those sorts of touches. Nothing too overt or detailed, just a few suggestions of detail. Once we've got our outline in, then that's all we need, is just to suggest the features. Just using horizontal lines to put in a bit of the darker tone of all the dark seaweed covered rocks in the very distance just below the cliffs. That sort of flattens out our horizon line a little bit as well and helps to bed our cliff into the beach. I think we're nearly there now. I'm just going to strengthen up these breakwater pilings a bit more, bring them up over the seawall to add that depth and distance. Straight away, this dark detail will just push that seawall back a little bit further. And then I can just darken up my pilings a little bit, maybe slightly less dark as they go further out into the distance, into the water. And then all I need to do is just put in a few lines, sketchy lines, hit and miss lines to show the shape of the beach and the sweep of the beach as it curves around from under the cliffs around into the foreground across the base of the scene. I'm not going to put in too much detail with the pen here. Most of that we'll leave to the brush. So just a few little indications of rocks and stones in the foreground, nothing too much, just a little reminder to put in a bit more detail there when we paint. So that's it for the first two stages, the sketch and the line work. I'm now going to step away and make sure everything is dry. So I'm going to have a nice cup of coffee, just in case there's any sort of traces of wet ink, because this ink only becomes waterproof when it's completely dry. So I'm going to be painting this using the wet in wet method. My board is at an angle of 45 degrees. 30 degrees is probably fine, but you do need a little bit of a tilt so that the gravity will help you to paint. The washes will be easier to create because they will sort of tend down the page and will keep a nice flow to the water. So I'm using my 1.5 inch Princeton Aqua Elite mottler brush, or use any large wash brush to just put some water into the sky. You can see that I'm painting the clean water onto the sky almost as if it was clouds. The reason for this is because then when I apply the paint, there will be some wet areas in the sky and some dry areas. This will give me soft and hard edges when I add my paint. I'm going to do a really simple sky for you today for beginners, just using cobalt blue, mixing up a nice puddle of nice watery but well pigmented blue, And I'm now going to work it into the wet areas of my paint. That's not quite blue enough, so I'm adding a little bit more cobalt blue to it. And now I'll use my wash brush to sort of scrub the paint around into the wet areas of sky, working around the dry patches. And hopefully this technique should give me the look of a summer blue sky with wispy white clouds. And the trick is now not to overwork it, to work quickly before your sky area dries, and to use the brush, the whole brush, the belly of the brush to apply the paint, and then the tips of the brush just to spread it around a little bit more, making sure it goes behind the cottages. And also bring it down over your sea area, and we're going to bring it down into the beach. So I'm just softening back here and there just to make sure that I've got no really hard edges. A few little hard edges here and there will just give us that impression of the clouds, but mostly we're looking for these soft edges. So I've decided to try and get some even darker blue into it, and as long as I work quickly I should be okay. As long as I'm working while the paper is still damp, there's still a sheen on the paper, so I can keep working and adding a little bit more paint. Once the sheen starts to go off of the page, that's when you need to step away and leave it alone, because if you add sort of more watery paint to it, then you could end up with cauliflowers and runbacks. Now this is a clean damp squirrel mop, and it's really useful just to soften and blend quickly while everything is still damp. This brush of mine is almost dry. You need to sort of make sure it's clean and damp, but then rub it into a tissue first to make sure it's only just damp, and then it's a great thing to use just to soften and blend. And then back to my flat modeler brush to just get a little bit of this pale blue paint and tone into the water and the sand. This way I'll have the sky colour reflected on the beach, so when I start building up the beach colours there's going to be a little bit of that blue there, so that reflected light, I'm creating that now. And now to start adding a bit into the beach. This is raw sienna, that's a little bit too strong, so I'm adding a bit more water to that, bringing that lovely raw sienna glow across most of the beach, leaving some gaps, and then putting it across the cliffs as well to give them that lovely, a warm sort of sandstone, chalky look. Then I can dip into some burnt umber and start adding some slightly darker tone to my beach. If you find you add too much, then you can clean off your brush and then just feather it through, spread it a little bit further. So I've got some tone starting off into my dark area of my sea wall as well. I'm trying to get those darker foreground areas and the beach. What I'm doing here is I'm painting wet in wet, applying the wet paint layers and allowing the paint to blend on the page. So I'm getting some subtle shifts of colour and tone on the page as I paint wet in wet. I'm keeping my brush strokes mostly horizontal on the beach. That keeps the beach nice and flat. And now getting in some nice dark shadows into these rocks in the foreground using a mixture of indigo and burnt sienna. A little bit of cobalt blue in there as well. Getting a bit of that lovely dark into the seawall. And then using a clean, damp, flat brush just to remove any paint that's sort of run down into the beach. So I get a nice flat edge to my seawall where it meets the beach. And then a bit of tone into other parts of the seawall just below the cottages. And here I'm using a vertical brush stroke, and this is to help describe the shape of that vertical part of the seawall. can just use a tissue to dab out any areas. If anything is sort of where it shouldn't be, yeah, don't panic if things don't go quite right. You can always lift out any paint that you've put in while it's still wet by dabbing it very carefully with a tissue. Now I'm going to paint in the trees around the cottages, and I'm using an Escoda Perla size 14 round brush. It's got a lovely point, and so I'm using it, and I'm using sap green to paint in this lovely sunlit grassy bank and the trees. I shall start to add a little bit of raw sienna and burnt sienna to the trees and the grass, just to vary up the tones a bit. And then once I've got that green in, I can mix up a little bit of darker tone into that green by putting a bit of indigo in it, and then using the tip of the brush just to build up a little bit of dark around the edges of the cottages. And I hope you can see how this darker tone is really starting to make the cottages stand out more and is really bringing some life to the painting. I think beginners sometimes can be a little bit tentative with tone and not use dark enough tones, which is often why beginners' paintings can sometimes look a little bit bland, because they're mostly painting in light tones and mid-tones and not focusing on the darks, and it's the darks that will bring a painting to life. So now I'm going to use the corner of a plastic store card, and I'm scraping it through the paint in the foreground, and this is just giving me the impressions of some little rock shapes without me having to paint them, just giving me those nice little highlights. And now using a 3/4 inch flat brush and putting some slightly darker tone underneath those high lit rocks, and then I'm going to just start to drag a little bit of this darker tone through the high tide line, or the sort of the water line, just using the tips of the flat brush to create these sort of horizontal narrow sweeps of mid-tone, just to again describe the flatness of the beach and to link sort of the water and the beach. Now I've decided that my grassy bank is too bright, so I'm going to lift that out with a tissue, and I can go back and work on that a little bit later. I think one of the drawbacks of using a ready-made green like sap green is that it can look a little bit flat and dull. So I'm hoping to get some life back into that once that area is dry. You can, of course, mix your own greens, but for beginners that could sometimes be a little bit of a problem. But I'd suggest maybe trying to mix your cobalt blue with a little bit of cad yellow, and you'll probably get really good results. So I think I've nearly finished with this underpainting, just a few more bits of paint to drop in before I leave it to dry completely. I'm going to put a little bit of burnt sienna and I'm going to sweep that across the beach in places just to warm things up a bit. And always remember, when you're sort of adding a bit more paint to any flat area like this, then keep your brush strokes flat, and it helps to keep the orientation of your land the way you want it to be. If you're painting slopes, then slope your brush strokes. It's really important to consider the direction of brush strokes. It can really help with sort of helping to differentiate different parts of your painting, different levels and layers. And now, just before leaving it to dry, I want to get a few darks in. So I'm going to add Paynes Grey to my already dark mix of burnt sienna and indigo and cobalt blue. And then I'm just going to just carefully work around my painting, putting in a few dark low lights where I think they're needed. a few just in the tide line. And I've noticed that the glaring white of the coastguard cottages is a little bit bright, so I'm just using a very watery mixture of cobalt blue just to take off the white of the paper, so it looks like there's a little bit of shadow and shade on those cottage walls. And then I'm going to darken up the sea walls. Those are large rusting cast iron girders, so they can be really nice and dark. And then finally, just a few nice dark shadows underneath some of the rocks in the foreground. Just using the corner of my 3/4 inch flat brush to make these little shapes. So now I'm going to let it dry completely and then come back and have a look, see how it looks and make any adjustments that I need to. Most important thing is I need to darken up the sea. And I'll need to darken up the trees around the cottages, add red roofs to the cottages and red chimneys, and maybe a few birds, something like that. But now, as I say, no fiddling, just walk away from it and let it dry completely. So here it is, it's all dried really nicely. So now I'm going to darken up my sea below the horizon line. I hope you can see there's some masking tape that I've put across just above my horizon line. Make sure it's pressed down nice and firmly so you get a nice crisp edge. And also, if you're not sure how your paper reacts to masking tape, then test it first on a piece of paper before you start painting, because some cheap papers will tear when you try to remove the masking tape from them. To be on the safe side, use a hairdryer across the masking tape to warm it up. And what this does is this loosens the glue on the back of the masking tape so you can peel it off without it damaging the paper. If you're using good cotton paper, it's very unlikely to tear though. Cotton paper, it's another one of the reasons that I like using it, is that it's so forgiving and so much easier to use than the cheap papers. So this is cobalt blue with a little bit of raw sienna and using the 3/4 inch flat brush, and you can see how easy it is to get that blue across the tape, and we should end up with a really nice straight flat horizon and this very nice differentiation between the colour of the sky and the colour of the sea, but everything will still be in harmony. Keeping your brush strokes horizontal and then blending that colour down into the rest of the body of water and into the beach, still leaving patches of the underpainting showing through. And now the sea's darkened up, just a fraction, then remove the masking tape, being careful to warm it up first with a hairdryer. And now onto the roofs of the cottages. So with a small brush with a fine point, a little bit of burnt sienna onto the roof of the cottage on the right and the chimneys of the other buildings, and just a little down the slope of the roofs, even though you can't see too much because they're gable end on. That little bit of red will really help. Then a little dash of red here and there into the grass and the trees around the cottage, and just a few little hints and little brush dabs here and there will just help to create the illusion of a little bit more detail and focus there on our focal point. Then just a light glaze of green across that grassy hillside. keeping it with a sort of fairly textured look. And now I just want to lift out a little bit of light just below the sea wall right here on the right side. So I'm using a stiff bristle brush that I've cut down really short, and I use it to scrub out any mistakes on dry paint. So I've dipped my scrubber into water and I'm just lightly brushing across the area that I want to lift, then dabbing out with a tissue and then going back in again, and you can see that just brings out a light highlight on the beach just below the sea wall and helps everything to stand out a bit better. So I've just zoomed in and I'm showing you how I'm using my dark mixture of paint, Paynes Grey, Indigo and Burnt Sienna, and I'm strengthening up my breakwater pilings a little bit more, making sure that they stand out really nicely against the seawall and the coastguard cottages. And then using the same brush and the same dark colour just to put in a few darks, maybe under the eaves, below the roof, and dotting in some darks to darken up the trees where they're closest to the cottages, just to help those cottages to stand out a little bit more and to break up and loosen up that tree line on the right, so it's just a little bit fresher. So now I think I'm just going to put a few gulls wheeling in the sky on the lookout for shellfish. So using my Pro Art size small sword liner, which has got a really fine point, and dipping into my dark mixture again, I'm painting really small gulls to keep them nicely in scale with the rest of the painting. I'm putting them so that they stand out nicely against the lighter parts of the sky. I think it just adds a really nice little finishing touch. So here's the finished painting. I'm going to remove the tape and have a look at it. When we see it with a clean white border, it helps us to see it with fresh eyes in a way, so we can see if we need to make any small adjustments to the painting. And don't forget to warm up your masking tape with your hairdryer, and it makes it easier to remove the tape. So here's the finished painting, and I hope that you enjoyed this, and you can see that even for a beginner this process is a nice simple process to follow, and with a bit of practice that it's a method of painting using the line and wash technique that can yield really beautiful results and can really help you to improve and practice your drawing skills as well as your watercolour painting skills. Thank you so much for watching. Please let me know, particularly the beginners amongst you, what you thought of that in the comments, whether or not it's been helpful for you to hear my thoughts and see my process in detail from start to finish. Because line and wash is such a wonderful technique. I'm hoping that videos like this will give you some really good transferable skills that you can then apply to your own photographs and your own scenes that you want to paint in a similar sort of way. So please give us a thumbs up and subscribe to my channel if you haven't already. And please let me know if you'd like to see more of these beginner-friendly tutorials like this that are a bit more in-depth than some of the tutorials and demos that we do here. And thank you so much to everyone that supports us on Patreon. We really do appreciate each and every one of you. So I'll see you again soon. Take care and happy painting. Bye.